Before he was a lawman of Dodge City, before the legends painted him as one of the West's deadliest gunmen, Bat Masterson was just a young scout and buffalo hunter, learning how quickly life could change on the frontier. In the summer of 1874, the plains would test him with heat, hunger, and the kind of danger that rode on both sides of the law. And before the year was out, a single night in a frontier saloon would leave a mark on him that no one could ignore. Welcome back to Chronicles of the Old West. This is Steel and Silk, the life of Bat Masterson, Episode 3, The Bullet and the Badge.
Before Dodge City, before the badge, before the stories of gamblers, gunmen, and frontier lawmen, there was a younger Bat Masterson, a boy just beginning to carve his name into the hard history of the West. And in the summer of 1874, that name was written in dust, sweat, and gun smoke. The sun rose hot over the Arkansas River as Colonel Nelson A. Miles assembled his force. 8 companies of the 6th Cavalry, 4 companies of the 5th Infantry. His orders were clear: subdue the hostile bands raiding through the Indian Territory and the Texas Panhandle. But to move across that harsh country, Miles needed men who knew it better than any soldier. Plainsmen, hide hunters, scouts. On August 5th, 1874, 2 men rode into his command who would become legends: Billy Dixon, the sharpshooter of Adobe Walls, and Bat Masterson, just 21 years old, heavy-shouldered from months on the buffalo range, his blue eyes sharp as rifle sights. The scout company they joined was small: 17 white frontiersmen and 20 Delaware trackers led by a 70-year-old chief named Falling Leaf. Miles called them men of courage and intelligence, and he was right. They were the best the frontier could offer. Expert riflemen, hunters turned soldiers, pay $75 a month to risk their lives guiding the army across hostile ground. By mid-August, the expedition was on the move, 3 wide columns pushing south from the Arkansas. Lieutenant Frank D. Baldwin led a detachment of 49 scouts, including Bat and Dixon, west toward Adobe Walls. The land was dry, sun-cracked, and deadly quiet. Then, at Crooked Creek, they found proof of what they were riding into. The bodies of 5 white surveyors lay scattered in grotesque shapes, their camp mutilated. Even the oxen and the camp dog had been slaughtered, their throats cut. Bat helped dig the shallow graves, his hands working silently in the dust while Baldwin stood grim-faced over the scene. That night, the plains erupted with a wind. A violent storm nearly stampeded the horses, and Baldwin recorded the moment in his diary. Had a hard time preventing horses from stampeding. All the men turned out except J.H. Plummer and C.E. Jones, who had to be ordered a second time. These 2 men will be discharged at the first opportunity. The following days would give them no time to think about it. On August 20th, Baldwin's scouts moved down the Canadian River, leaving Adobe Walls behind. They rode into Fresh Indian Sign near the mouth of Chicken Creek, a war party. The scouts fanned out, rifles leveled. In a quick exchange of fire, 1 warrior was killed, another wounded. Baldwin noted grimly in his diary, "The Indian signs are fresh, and we will probably see plenty of them before we rejoin the command." That night, Lieutenant Baldwin needed answers. His scouts had found Fresh Indian Sign along the Canadian River, and he suspected a large war party was moving nearby. If he guessed wrong, his small detachment could be surrounded and cut off before reaching Colonel Miles's main force. So Baldwin turned to 2 of his most reliable men, Bat Masterson and another scout, McGinty. Their orders were simple but dangerous. Ride 55 miles through open, hostile country to deliver a message to Colonel Miles at Wolf Creek, warning him of the growing danger and asking for instructions. The two scouts slipped out of camp at 9 o'clock, vanishing into the dark prairie. They carried no extra gear, only their rifles, ammunition, and their nerve. Every mile was a risk. The plains were alive with war parties that summer. And if Bat and McGinty were caught in the moonlight, they would never make it back. Through the long night, they rode fast, stopping only to water their horses, scanning every ridge and shadow for movement. By dawn, Bat was back in camp with the news Baldwin feared. Indian war parties were thick along the trail ahead. When the message reached Colonel Miles, he didn't hesitate. He immediately shifted his line of march southwesterly, driving his command straight into the heart of Indian country. The running fights that would follow, culminating in the battle on the bluffs, began with that single dispatch. Bat's midnight ride had set the course. The march became a trial by fire. 25 miles a day under a killing sun, the men moving like shadows across a land baked to dust. The summer of 1874 was merciless. The drought had turned the plains into a shimmering furnace. Water holes were dry or worse, white with alkali that burned the tongue and split the lips. Men cracked under the heat. Horses foamed at the flanks and dropped where they stood. Some soldiers, half mad with thirst, cut open their own veins and sucked at the blood just to wet their mouths. But Colonel Nelson Miles never slowed. The trail was fresh, too fresh, and he meant to strike before the warriors could vanish into the staked plains. By August 30th, Bat Masterson rode with the scouts ahead of the main column, following that trail into a country of broken ridges and sunburned gullies on the edge of the staked plains. At dawn, they entered a narrow pass, the walls of rock rising on both sides. And then, the world erupted. From the bluffs above, 250 Comanche and Kiowa warriors poured fire into the pass, their war cries echoing off the stone like a thunderclap. Bullets and arrows hissed down in sheets, kicking up dirt, splintering rock. The scouts broke for cover instantly, sliding from their saddles, diving behind rocks and into shallow washes. Bat Masterson hit the ground hard, rolled into a gully, and braced his rifle against a stone outcrop. Around him, the Delaware trackers moved with deadly calm, their faces set, their shots coming slow and measured, every round placed with care. The first Comanche charge crashed forward, a wave of painted ponies and flashing lances, but the scouts' rifles spoke with brutal precision. The line broke, warriors falling from their mounts, ponies screaming as they tumbled. The survivors fell back to the high ground, firing down into the pass, but the fight was already changing. Then came the sound they had all been waiting for, the thunder of hooves. Cavalry. 2 battalions of blue-coated troopers swept forward, spurring their mounts hard, driving straight into the bluffs. The air filled with smoke and dust as a battery of Gatling guns clattered into position, their barrels spinning. The first long bursts tore into the ridge, and the warriors began to break, scattering into the gullies. Miles ordered the charge to continue, and for 20 miles the scouts and cavalry pressed the fight. A running battle across the plains, shooting down rearguard parties, chasing the war bands until their own horses began to stagger. By late afternoon, the men were spent. Some slid from their saddles and could not climb back up. Miles finally called a halt, setting camp near a shallow creek that barely held enough water to fill their canteens. The scouts had survived the fight, but no one believed it was over. This was only the first clash. The campaign dragged into winter, grinding down the Indian resistance. By March 1875, the Cheyennes, Kiowas, and Comanches had been forced back to their reservations. With the danger fading, the buffalo hunters returned to the plains. And where hunters gathered, towns sprang up like weeds. The biggest of them was Sweetwater, a wild mix of adobe buildings and sod-roof saloons that served as a supply hub for the buffalo trade. It was a place of whiskey, gambling, and easy violence. And Bat Masterson, now 21 and already known as a crack rifleman, was right in the middle of it. He had grown broader in the shoulders, his face darkened by sun and wind, his black mustache making him look older than he was. Among hunters and scouts, his name carried weight. A man who knew rifles, who had fought Indians, who could survive in country that killed lesser men. But Sweetwater was not just buffalo hunters. It was gamblers, saloon girls, and men with quick tempers and quicker guns. And soon, Bat Masterson would learn just how quickly Sweetwater could turn deadly. Sweetwater was alive after dark, a rough patchwork of firelight and laughter, card tables and whiskey barrels. In the Lady Gay Saloon, the air was thick with cigar smoke, the sharp smell of spilled liquor, and the metallic rattle of poker chips sliding across worn tabletops. The Lady Gay wasn't much to look at, a squat, adobe building with warped floors and a cracked bar, but it was one of the busiest spots in town. Hunters and skinners crowded in after long days on the range, dropping hard-earned dollars on whiskey, cards, and the occasional saloon girl drifting through the haze. Bat Masterson was a regular there. Not for the women or even for the gambling, but for the company. Among the buffalo hunters, he was known as a man you could talk to, drink with, or trust to settle an argument fair. But Sweetwater was full of men who didn't care about fair. The trouble, as it often did in the Old West, began over a woman. Her name was Molly Brennan, a young dance hall girl with a warm laugh and a reputation for kindness. She wasn't the kind of woman men fought over for money or jealousy alone. It was the way she treated people. Hunters, scouts, even soldiers spoke well of her, saying she had a way of making a man forget, for a moment, how hard and lonely life on the plains could be. Two men wanted her attention that night. One was Corporal Melvin King, a U.S. Army trooper from the nearby post. King was a hard drinker with a quick temper, the kind of man who wore his revolver like an extra piece of his ego. The other was Bat Masterson. Bat wasn't courting Molly in any serious way, at least not that night. The two sat at a small table in the Lady Gay Saloon, sharing a quiet drink. Witnesses later said there was nothing romantic or heated in their conversation. Just a young woman laughing softly at a man who, unlike most hunters, spoke to her with a little respect. But King didn't see it that way. The corporal had been drinking heavily, and by the time he learned where Molly was, his temper was already boiling. To him, it didn't matter whether Bat meant anything by it. Molly was the girl he wanted, and Bat Masterson was in the way. King stormed into the Lady Gay just after sundown, his boots striking the warped floorboards hard enough to turn heads. His face was red, his jaw set, and his Army-issue Colt revolver rode low on his hip, worn the way men wore it when they expected to use it. Bat looked up as the door swung open. The noise in the saloon, laughter, poker chips clinking, the low hum of conversation faded fast. Men shifted in their chairs, glancing from Bat to the angry soldier filling the doorway. The room went quiet. Everyone in the Lady Gay could feel it. Trouble had just walked in. What happened next would be argued about for years, but the facts were these. King didn't hesitate. Before Bat could even rise from his chair, the corporal's hand flashed to his hip. The Colt cleared leather, and the first shot roared through the smoky saloon. The bullet struck Bat low in the pelvis, spinning him sideways. He collapsed hard onto the floor, his chair skidding out behind him. Witnesses later swore he was already reaching for his own revolver, even as he fell, his face pale but focused. Molly Brennan screamed. She darted forward, instinctively trying to help him, but King fired again, almost instantly. The second bullet caught her in the abdomen, tearing through her dress. She gasped, staggered once, and collapsed beside Bat, blood spreading fast across the floorboards. Bat, half stunned from the pain, fought to stay conscious. Gritting his teeth, he dragged himself with one arm behind an overturned chair, his free hand fumbling for the Colt at his belt. The Lady Gay erupted in chaos. Men dove for the floor as tables overturned, and poker chips scattered, hunters scrambling for cover. Chairs clattered, glasses shattered, and someone shouted for everyone to get down. The saloon had turned into a battlefield in seconds. Slumped against the overturned chair, he forced himself upright, his teeth clenched against the burning pain in his pelvis. His hand found the grip of his Colt .45, slick with sweat, and he steadied the barrel across the edge of the chair. King was still coming. The corporal moved forward, his revolver raised, his jaw tight with determination. Witnesses later said there was no hesitation in his eyes. He was sure the next bullet would finish Bat for good. But Bat was waiting. When King stepped into range, Bat squeezed the trigger. The first shot hit King square in the chest, driving him backward. He stumbled, but Bat didn't stop. His second shot came almost immediately, striking true. The corporal crashed to the floor, his revolver skidding from his hand and clattering across the warped boards. And just like that, it was over. The smoke hung low in the saloon, curling around the lantern light as silence settled over the room. Molly Brennan lay bleeding out on the floor beside Bat, her breaths coming shallow and slow. King was already dead. Bat Masterson, still conscious but losing blood fast, let the Colt fall from his hand as friends rushed to his side. They lifted him carefully, afraid any sudden movement might finish what the bullet had started. No one in the Lady Gay knew if Bat would survive the night. But if he did, they knew one thing for certain. His life and his reputation would never be the same. Molly Brennan died within hours, her body buried just outside of town. King's was placed in a shallow grave, his name cursed by half the hunters in Sweetwater for bringing death into a place where they drank to forget the war outside. Bat Masterson recovered slowly, the bullet lodged too deep in his pelvis to remove. For weeks he walked with a heavy limp, sometimes using a cane when the pain was bad. But he survived. And from that night forward, his name carried a new weight. The buffalo hunters already respected him as a rifleman. But now they saw him as something more. A man who could take a bullet, stay calm under fire, and still put his enemy down. Stories spread fast across the plains. Some said Bat had killed King with a single perfect shot. Others claimed he had kept firing even as he dragged himself across the floor. The details didn't matter. What mattered was that Bat Masterson had faced death head-on and won. Bat Masterson never set out to be called a gunfighter. But after Sweetwater, the name stuck to him whether he wanted it or not. Men talked about him in the same breath as seasoned pistol men. He wasn't the kind to go looking for a fight, they said. But if trouble found him, he ended it, and fast. In the West, a reputation like that was a double-edged sword. It could make a man safer because few dared to test him. But it also drew the wrong kind of attention, men eager to prove themselves or to make their own name by gunning down someone already known. For Bat, Sweetwater was only the beginning. The Old West was changing. The great buffalo herds were vanishing, the Indian wars grinding to a close. The hard men of the plains, the hunters, scouts, and soldiers, would soon drift toward new frontiers. The cow towns, the gambling halls, and the law offices where badges were handed out to men who could keep order with their fists or their guns. Bat would be one of them, but that was still to come. For now, Bat Masterson, just 21 years old, walking with a limp from the bullet that nearly killed him, was already on his way to becoming a legend. When Bat limped into Dodge City in the spring of 1876, it wasn't the dusty buffalo hunting camp he had left behind 2 years earlier. The town had grown into something larger, louder, and more dangerous. Cattle now ruled the plains, and the new money came from Texas longhorns driven up the Western Trail to the Santa Fe railhead. The talk everywhere was of cowboys, tough, trail-hardened men who would soon flood Dodge by the thousands. The town was ready for them, or at least it thought it was. Front Street, the main artery of Dodge, was a jumble of saloons, hotels, gambling halls, and supply stores. The Long Branch Saloon was already famous with Chalk Beeson's music, drifting into the street at night. Across the way sat the Alhambra Saloon, a noisy gambling hall owned by Dog Kelly and Peter Beatty. Luke Short, a professional gambler, was running faro tables, and the Delmonico restaurant served steaks big enough to feed a trail hand for a week. But for every business catering to the cowboys, there was trouble brewing. The townspeople had seen what happened in other cattle towns, Abilene, Ellsworth, Wichita, where Texas drovers galloped their ponies down the main streets, firing wildly into the air, shattering windows, and occasionally killing anyone unlucky enough to be in their way. Dodge wanted the money, but it didn't want to be destroyed in the process. And that's where Wyatt Earp came in. In May 1876, Mayor George Hoover wired Wichita for help. Dodge needed a man who could keep order without starting a war, someone the cowboys respected, or feared. Wyatt didn't hold the official title of city marshal. Larry Degger, a 300-pound saloonkeeper, still wore the badge. But Mayor George Hoover hired Wyatt as chief deputy, giving him real authority to hire, fire, and run the town's law enforcement as he saw fit. Wyatt's approach was straightforward. Arrests paid better when the prisoners were taken alive, so he avoided gunfights whenever possible. To keep order, he drew a strict boundary. South of the tracks, in the red light district, vice and gambling were tolerated. North of the line, on a front street, any trouble was dealt with quickly and firmly. Wyatt was as famous for his fists as for his gun. He preferred to buffalo rowdy cowboys, slamming them over the head with the heavy barrel of his Colt rather than killing them outright. It earned him grudging respect from the cowhands, who might wake up bruised and broke but alive. Bat Masterson later wrote that Wyatt was one of the few men in the West absolutely destitute of physical fear. But even Wyatt Earp couldn't run Dodge City alone. He needed men he could trust, men who wouldn't flinch when things turned ugly. Bat Masterson arrived in Dodge City, still nursing the wound he had taken at Sweetwater. He walked with a slight limp and carried a cane, not for style, but because he still needed it to keep steady. But Bat was no longer just another buffalo hunter drifting through town. He was a man with a reputation now, and Dodge already knew his name. The story of the Lady Gay Saloon shootout had spread fast. Bat Masterson was the young hunter who had taken a bullet, stayed calm under fire, and put his attacker in the ground. In Dodge, that counted for something. Wyatt Earp noticed. Wyatt offered Bat a job as a deputy, and Bat took it. He was assigned to patrol Front Street, the heart of Dodge, where saloons, gambling halls, and trail-hardened cowboys made for long nights. For weeks, Bat relied on his cane as much as his Colt. Trouble was constant. Rowdy cowhands firing pistols in the air, drunks refusing to hand over their guns, fights spilling out of saloon doors. Some men took one look at Bat's limp and figured he'd be easy to push around. They learned fast how wrong they were. Even as an injured man, Bat earned a reputation as a peace officer who wouldn't back down. He used his cane like a weapon, cracking it across the skulls and knuckles of men who tested him, saving his revolver for when he truly needed it. Over time, Wyatt and Bat developed a bond that went beyond their badges. They shared drinks at the Long Branch, swapped stories about the Buffalo Range and Indian campaigns, and backed each other when trouble came. Wyatt trusted Bat as one of the few men who would stand shoulder to shoulder with him in a fight. And Bat respected Wyatt as a man who treated law enforcement like a job, not a chance for glory. The cowboys learned quickly, if you crossed one of them, you crossed both. It was during these years that Bat Masterson began to cement his reputation not just as a lawman, but as a man other lawmen trusted with their lives. And Wyatt Earp was one of the first to see that potential in him. One of his first arrests as a deputy became the talk of the town. A drunken range rider refused to surrender his revolver at the edge of town, laughing as he waved it in the air. Bat, still limping from his wound, walked straight toward him, calm and steady. Without a word, he swung his cane across the man's knuckles with a sharp crack. The revolver went spinning into the dirt. The cowboy cursed, clutching his hand, but he didn't fight. He paid his fine the next morning and even laughed about it later. The message, however, was clear, to him and to everyone watching. Dodge City might be a cattle town, but it wasn't going to be easy pickings. Not with Bat Masterson on Front Street. Dodge City was more than just saloons, cattle money, and gun smoke. It was politics, and those politics were sharply divided. On one side stood the so-called law and order men, Mayor George Hoover, physician Sam Galland, and livery owner Ham Bell. They wanted to clean up Dodge, placing restrictions on liquor, gambling, and gunplay, hoping to turn the town into something closer to a respectable community. On the other side stood the Dodge City Gang, saloon owners, gamblers, and buffalo hunters like Bob Wright, Dog Kelly, and Peter Beatty. They believed Dodge's future depended on staying wide open, giving the Texas cowboys the freedom to drink, gamble, and spend their trail money with no questions asked. Bat Masterson stood firmly with the gang. He had no interest in turning Dodge into a quiet frontier town. To Bat, Dodge was a cattle town, wild, rowdy, and profitable. And trying to change that was foolish. More importantly, Bat was loyal to the men who had supported him. Men like Dog Kelly and Bob Wright, who had always backed the hunters and scouts. Over time, Bat became one of the gang's most respected enforcers, not because he was the fastest gun, but because he was fair and fearless. He didn't back down from anyone, and when he settled a dispute, people on both sides usually considered it just. In a town where politics were as dangerous as a saloon brawl, that reputation meant everything. Bat Masterson's reputation grew quickly, and though he walked with a limp, he was no easy target. Bill Tillman, another future lawman, later recalled Bat's skill with a 6-gun, saying he could hit a thrown tin cup in the air at 25 cents a shot and make money doing it. Bat's own philosophy was practical. You used your sights if you meant to kill a man. You hip shot only when you had no other choice. That discipline made him deadly when it counted. But Dodge wasn't just a job for Bat. It was also a place to gamble, drink, and sometimes get into trouble. In June of 1876, Bat Masterson's temper nearly got him into serious trouble. The incident began when a well-known local drunk, Bobby Gill, mouthed off to City Marshal Larry Dager. Dager, a 300-pound former saloon keeper with a reputation for rough handling prisoners, decided to teach Gill a lesson. As he hauled the drunk toward the calaboose, Dager started kicking him along the street like a stray dog. Bat was standing on the sidewalk watching. He didn't like what he saw. With a grin, part amusement, part challenge, Bat stepped forward, hooked one arm around Dager's thick neck, and yanked him back. At the same time, he gave Bobby Gill a shove, letting the drunk stumble off into the street and make his escape. Dager didn't think it was funny. The two men grappled, Bat still laughing even as they locked up, but it turned serious fast. Dager's deputies rushed in, surrounding Bat, demanding he hand over his gun. Bat refused. Witnesses later said he fought like a wildcat, swinging his fists and shoving men aside, holding tight to his revolver as if daring anyone to try taking it from him. It finally took half a dozen Texas cowboys, friends of neither man but amused by the spectacle, to wrestle Bat into submission and drag him to the jail. He spent the night in the calaboose and was fined $25 the next morning for disturbing the peace. But among the cowboys of Dodge, the story only made Bat more popular. Here was a lawman who wasn't afraid to stand up to another badge and wasn't afraid to get thrown in jail for it. By the summer of 1877, Bat Masterson's star was on the rise. His work alongside Wyatt Earp had earned him a reputation as a lawman who was both fair and fearless, a man who could be trusted to handle the roughest elements of Dodge without losing his cool. That reputation reached Charlie Bassett, the well-liked sheriff of Ford County. Bassett had been running the county with a steady hand since Dodge City first became a cattle town. But his term was coming to an end. He needed someone ready to take over, someone who could handle the pressures of being sheriff in one of the wildest towns on the frontier. Bassett chose Bat. He appointed the young lawman as his undersheriff, grooming him as his natural successor. For Bat, it was more than just a promotion. It was a sign that he was no longer seen as a hunter or gambler with a fast gun. He was now trusted as a legitimate peace officer. Bat took the job seriously. As undersheriff, he tracked down horse thieves across the open prairie, following trails for days at a time, until he brought the animals and the thieves back to Dodge. He handled disputes over stolen property, settling them quickly and, more often than not, without a shot fired. But when gunplay was necessary, Bat didn't hesitate. On more than one occasion, he faced down armed outlaws, suspected train robbers, and trail raiders who thought Dodge lawmen would back away when things got rough. They were wrong. Bat's cool, deliberate nature served him well. He didn't fire wildly or rush his shots. When he raised his revolver, he aimed, and he hit what he aimed at. It was during this time that Bat began to shift fully from his old life into something new. A respected lawman, trusted by his peers, feared by outlaws, and admired by the cowboys who saw him as one of their own. And Charlie Bassett wasn't wrong. When his term ended, Bat Masterson would be ready to wear the star. Lawman or not, Bat Masterson never gave up his love for the gambling life. Even as undersheriff, he still felt at home among the saloons and faro tables, where fortunes changed hands with the turn of a card, and where a man's reputation could be made or destroyed before sunrise. With his friend Ben Springer, Bat opened the Lone Star Dance Hall, one of the wildest and most profitable establishments south of the Santa Fe tracks, in the part of Dodge where the rules were looser and the cowboys came to spend their hard-earned trail money. The Lone Star was everything a cowboy could want after weeks on the trail. A long mahogany bar stretched across one side of the room, its surface polished smooth by spilled whiskey and the elbows of countless drovers. Behind it, bottles of liquor gleamed in the lantern light, cheap whiskey for the cowhands, imported brandy for the gamblers who thought themselves gentlemen. On the other side of the hall, poker and faro tables stayed busy from dusk until dawn. Dealers worked fast, cards flashing in the lamplight, while cowboys slapped down silver dollars with loud laughs and louder curses. Every so often, a cheer went up when someone hit a winning streak, but just as often, chairs scraped back and hands went for holstered guns when tempers flared. In the center of the room, the dance floor stayed crowded, packed with laughing girls in bright dresses, their cheeks rouged, their hair piled high with ribbons and feathers. They twirled trail-hardened cowboys across the floor to the sound of a fiddler sawing out lively tunes, always smiling, always watching for the next man with coins to spend. The Lone Star was rowdy, profitable, and dangerous, and Bat Masterson thrived in it. He was both a host and a peacekeeper, moving easily among the tables, chatting with gamblers and trail riders alike. Cowboys respected him. He was one of them once, and unlike some lawmen, he didn't look down on a man for gambling or drinking. But when trouble came, Bat didn't hesitate to take control. On more than one occasion, fights erupted that nearly turned into full gun battles. Bat knew how to handle them before the first shot was fired. A sharp word, a firm grip on a drunk's arm, or a crack across the knuckles with his ever-present cane. When words in the cane failed, there was always the Colt on his hip, and Bat didn't need to draw it often to remind men it was there. The Lone Star wasn't just a business. It was an extension of Bat himself, a place where he could gamble, make money, and still keep the peace, all without losing the respect he had earned as a lawman. It was a dangerous balance to keep, but Bat managed it well. And with every night he spent walking that dance hall floor, his legend in Dodge City grew just a little bit bigger. By the fall of 1877, Bat Masterson had become more than just a deputy or a gambler. He was a name. The cowboys spoke of him with respect, sometimes fear. Other lawmen trusted him with their lives, and men like Wyatt Earp valued him as a partner who could be counted on in a fight. Bat didn't seek fame, but the West had a way of writing its own legends. And Bat Masterson's was only just beginning.
Bat Masterson came to Dodge limping from Sweetwater, a young hunter with a steady hand and a cool nerve. By the time he walked Front Street with Wyatt Earp at his side, he'd learned that keeping the peace was as much about knowing when to smile as when to draw. Every day, he built allies, earned respect, and proved he could hold the line when trouble came calling. The Buffalo Range had taught him to survive. Dodge City was teaching him to lead. And soon, that badge wouldn't be borrowed. It would be his. Here at Chronicles of the Old West, we don't just dust off names and dates. We dig into the grit and gun smoke to find the heartbeat of those who lived it. What you've heard comes from soldiers' diaries, frontier newspapers, court ledgers, and the fading words Bat Masterson left behind, woven into a living picture you can feel. If this story sharpened your view of the West, or gave new weight to a name you thought you knew, leave a rating or review, or share it with someone who still believes the past should be felt, not just remembered. Bat Masterson's trail is far from over. The man in the bowler hat has miles to ride, and the West is about to test him in ways no saloon or cattle town ever could. Subscribe now for the next chapter of Steel and Silk, the life of Bat Masterson, only here on Chronicles of the Old West.